The morning air over Gaza is thick with dust and grief. Crumbling hospital walls cast long shadows across cracked roads. In the rubble lie discarded toys, broken dreams, lives shattered before they even began. The Gaza Health Ministry estimates that more than 64,000 Palestinians have been killed since October 2023, with women and children, 70% of the victims, paying the highest price. Children have died at a horrific rate, more than one child every hour, day and night for nearly 2 years. Schools turned into shelters were struck in the chaos. Over 5,800 students killed, at least 600,000 children denied education, and 352 school buildings damaged or destroyed. Hospitals, once the last refuge, lie in ruins. 94% of Gaza's hospitals are damaged or destroyed, leaving only 19 out of 36 operational, many barely providing emergency care. More than 50,000 children have been killed or injured, many maimed for life, and thousands face disabilities they never asked for. Every number, every broken building, every orphaned child whispers a terrifying question. How did history lead to this? To find the answer, we must step back. A century of shifting borders, promises, betrayals, migrations, and wars set the stage. We begin this story at the twilight of the Ottoman Empire, when the seed of today's conflict was quietly being sown. The dawn of the 20th century, much of the Middle East, including what would become Israel and Palestine, was under Ottoman rule, a sprawling Islamic empire that had lasted for centuries, but was steadily crumbling. It was a time of political upheaval and nationalist ideas. In 1914, World War I tore into the region. The Ottomans sided with the Central Powers and lost. Their collapse opened the door for new rulers, the British. In 1917, as the war raged, the British issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, but with the condition that nothing would undermine the rights of the existing non-Jewish communities. The declaration sounded equitable, but on the ground it launched a wave of Jewish immigration into a land already inhabited by Arabs, Muslim and Christian, who had lived there for centuries. The seeds of tension sprouted quickly. During the Alway, British Mandate era, Jewish settlers who fled persecution in Europe began settling in Palestine. Zionist pioneers founded kibbutzim, universities and industrial enterprises, and while they faced hardship, they also secured political backing from powerful nations. Meanwhile, Arab Palestinians felt sidelined, fearful that they were becoming strangers in their own land. Tensions rose throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Protest movements, both Jewish and Arab, often turned violent. The British struggled to maintain order. In 1936, Arab revolt erupted in peaceful, then violent resistance to both colonial rule and immigration. Britain proposed partition plans, but none satisfied both sides. The Holocaust changed everything. Europe's Jews, fleeing genocide, found refuge in Palestine. Britain, wrestling with moral guilt and political pressure, handed the issue to the United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed partitioning Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem under international control. The Jewish leadership accepted. Arab leaders rejected it as unfair. On May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence. Immediately, armies from Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon invaded. Israel surprised many by winning the war. The map was redrawn. Israel controlled more land than the UN partition had allotted, but the birth of one state carried the trauma of another. Around 750,000 Palestinians fled or were expelled, becoming refugees overnight. Homes became refugee camps. Families were uprooted. Palestinian society fractured. That was the first Arab-Israeli war, a defining moment. Some call it the Nakba, the catastrophe. For Israelis, it was the war of independence. For Palestinians, it was a tragedy of displacement. In the years that followed, the conflict simmered. Armistice lines held, but hostilities continued. Gaza fell under Egyptian control, the West Bank under Jordanian. Palestinian identity, once fluid, began to crystallize around a shared experience of loss and exile. The refugee became a symbol of statelessness and hope for return. Meanwhile, Israel absorbed Jewish refugees from Europe and the Arab world. Its population swelled. In the new nation, ideology and survival fused. The motto never again resonated with a people who had just survived genocide and who lived surrounded by hostility. By the mid-1950s, tensions had escalated. Palestinian frustrations grew. Arab nationalism surged across the Middle East. In response, various Palestinian groups formed, though they had limited support at first. Israel's borders remained porous and skirmishes were common. The crisis boiled over in 1967 during the Six-Day War. Israel struck first, blaming adversaries preparing to attack, and captured the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Syrian Golan Heights. The map of the region changed dramatically, and with it, the way Palestinians and Israelis saw their futures forever. In Egypt and other Arab capitals, grief became rage. For Palestinians, it was further erasure. But a generation emerged determined to resist. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded, promising to liberate Palestine through armed struggle. Its leader Yasser Arafat would become synonymous with the cause. The post-1967 years were marked by both repression and rebellion. The PLO launched attacks. Israel responded with military force and strict control over occupied territories. Palestinians suffered under curfews, checkpoints, and closures. The 1973 Yom Kippur War brought new horrors, but also shook the status quo. Israel repelled the war but realized its existential vulnerability. The superpowers intervened to enforce a ceasefire. Diplomacy for a moment replaced war. The 1970s and 1980s saw yet another dimension. Palestinian identity grew more complex. Refugee camps became hubs of resistance. Civil society formed. Cultural expression persisted despite occupation. But true transformation came with the first intifada in 1987, a grassroots uprising of youth, women and families throwing stones and calling for rights. It turned the world's attention to the plight of the occupied. Israel responded with force. Confrontations emptied streets, prisons filled. But the intifada made Israeli occupation a global issue of human rights. It drove the US and others toward diplomacy. By 1993, hope sparked with the Oslo Accords. Israel and the PLO recognized each other. Gaza and parts of the West Bank got limited self-rule. Palestinian officials walked into offices for the first time. The Oslo handshake was to lead to peace. But decades later, it had become a bitter memory. Broken promises, continued settlement expansion, and violence from both sides shattered trust. The optimism of Oslo collapsed. Violence returned with the Second Intifada in 2000. Suicide bombings, reoccupation, the security barrier, violence erupted anew with devastating consequences and stalled hopes. Throughout this century, ambition and bloodshed collided repeatedly. Yet through it all, both Israeli and Palestinian narratives grow, the defiance, the fear, the longing. The hope of peace that flickered in the 1990s slowly dimmed, until it seemed to vanish entirely. The Oslo Accords had promised a roadmap, a two-state solution, and a future of coexistence. But what followed was not peace. It was more checkpoints, more settlements, and more frustration. For Palestinians, daily life in the West Bank and Gaza remained a constant reminder that freedom was still out of reach. And for Israelis, waves of violence bred fear and suspicion. The dream of two states began to look like a mirage in the desert. And then, in the year 2000, everything collapsed. The Second Intifada erupted. It wasn't just stones in the street like the first uprising. This time, suicide bombings tore through buses and cafes in Israeli cities. Families lived in fear of every bus ride. The Israeli response was fierce. Tanks rolled into Palestinian towns. Airstrikes leveled buildings. and a massive separation barrier began to snake across the landscape, carving deep divisions not just in geography, but in hearts and minds. Jerusalem became a flashpoint, as it always had been. Each side clung to it as their eternal capital. For Palestinians, the barrier wall cutting through neighborhoods became the symbol of suffocation. For Israelis, it was seen as protection. But walls cannot erase despair, and violence only deepened mistrust. Then came Hamas. While the Palestine Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat pursued negotiations, Hamas emerged as a rival force, rejecting Oslo, rejecting compromise, and calling for armed resistance. In 2006, Hamas stunned the world by winning the Palestinian legislative elections. A year later, it seized control of Gaza after bloody clashes with Fatah. From then on, Gaza and the West Bank were not only separated by Israeli restrictions, but by political divisions among Palestinians themselves. Gaza became the center of recurring wars. In 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and beyond, Israeli forces and Hamas exchanged rockets and airstrikes. The results were devastating. Thousands of Palestinians killed, neighborhoods flattened, power grids destroyed. Israel, too, suffered. Casualties, though on a much smaller scale, but the disproportionate destruction burned Gaza deeper into crisis. Each round of war was followed by uneasy ceasefires. Each ceasefire left Gaza weaker, poorer, and more desperate. The blockade imposed by Israel and Egypt restricted movement of goods and people. Unemployment soared. Families survived on aid. For 2 million people living in a strip barely 40 kilometers long, life became a cycle of war and waiting for the next war. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, settlements expanded. What was once envisioned as a future Palestinian state looked more like scattered islands surrounded by Israeli control. Checkpoints, military patrols, and a constant presence of tension marked everyday life. The dream of independence felt more distant than ever. As the 21st century rolled on, international politics shaped the conflict further. The United States, Israel's closest ally, played a central role. American presidents tried to mediate peace, but often tilted toward Israel's positions. Palestinians felt abandoned. Their calls for justice drowned in the geopolitics of the Cold War's aftermath and the War on Terror. Then, new dynamics emerged. Some Arab states, once fierce opponents of Israel, began to normalize relations. The Abraham Accords in 2020 saw countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain establish ties with Israel. For Palestinians, it felt like betrayal. Arab solidarity, once their strongest shield, was fading. But none of this prepared the world for what would erupt in October 2023. Hamas launched a shocking attack into southern Israel, breaching barriers, killing civilians, and capturing hostages. For Israelis, it was the darkest day in decades. For Palestinians, it unleashed the most devastating retaliation Gaza had ever seen. The Israeli military campaign in Gaza was relentless. Whole neighborhoods disappeared in plumes of smoke. Hospitals were bombed. Refugee camps turned into graveyards. According to humanitarian reports, by mid-2025, more than 64,000 Palestinians had been killed. At least 50,000 children were killed or injured, an entire generation scarred forever. Schools became rubble. 352 school buildings were damaged or destroyed, leaving hundreds of thousands of children without education. Hospitals collapsed under bombing and shortages. Only 19 out of 36 remained partially functional. Gaza's health system, once fragile, was pushed past the breaking point, and yet despite the destruction, the conflict only hardened. Israel argued that its war was about survival, about destroying Hamas after the October 2023 massacre. Palestinians argued that survival itself had become impossible under siege, occupation, and endless bombardment. In the streets of Gaza, children drew pictures of drones instead of doves. In Tel Aviv, families lit candles for loved ones lost in terror attacks. Two peoples trapped in a century-old tragedy, still unable to see a future beyond war. But history doesn't stop here. The story of Israel and Palestine has always been about more than borders or armies. It's about identity, memory, and the human will to endure. What's striking is how both narratives, Israeli and Palestinian, are built on trauma. For Jews, the Holocaust and centuries of persecution created an unshakable need for security, for a homeland where they could never again be defenseless. For Palestinians, the Nakba of 1948, the exile, the refugee camps, and the endless years of occupation created an unshakable demand for justice, dignity, and return. Both sides see themselves as victims of history. Both tell their children stories of loss. And both feel the world does not understand their pain. The question then becomes, can two peoples who both carry unhealed wounds ever find common ground? Or is the conflict destined to rage on, one generation after another, until exhaustion forces an end? Some look to solutions, a two-state compromise, though the map makes it increasingly difficult. Others speak of one shared state, though mistrust runs too deep. Many tragically see only war. What's clear is this: the conflict is not frozen in the past. It continues to evolve, and every year adds another chapter written in blood and rubble. The war of 2023-2025 may go down as one of the darkest, but history teaches us that tragedies here are never final. They are always preludes to the next act. So we return to the present, to the cries in Gaza's streets and the sirens in Israel's skies. Behind every headline there are human beings, families, children, parents who want what we all want: safety, freedom, dignity, peace. The tragedy of Israel and Palestine is not just that war has destroyed so much, but that peace has always felt just out of reach. Every attempt has stumbled, every opportunity has slipped away. But history shows us that even the bloodiest conflicts can end. Even the deepest wounds can, over generations, heal. The question is, will this century of conflict finally teach the world, and the two peoples at its center, that there is no victory in destruction? That the only future lies in coexistence? That answer has not yet been written. And perhaps that is why the world still watches Israel and Palestine, not just as a tragedy of the past, but as a test of humanity's future.